Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us, taking the time to join us for what is the first in a series of winter webinars from Germinal. My name is Ben Wixey, and I am the National Sales Manager for Germinal. And before I introduce our resident grass and forage expert, Helen Matthews, I've just got a few housekeeping points to bring up. Firstly, the session is being recorded. We will send you the link in the next few days with the recording. So should you wish to go back over bits or watch it again, you'll be able to. And secondly, can I encourage you to ask questions? There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you click on that and type your questions in, I will either interject with Helen during the presentation or more likely do a question and answer session at the end. So just before we start, I just want to talk to you a bit about Germinal. Germinal is a family-owned business, 7th generation, and in 2025 we will be 200 years old. We run our business with the standards and morals that you'd expect of a business that has 200 years of heritage. But we firmly believe in innovation and research, whether that is at Aberystwyth University with the IVAS programme, or at the Germinal Research Station down in Melksham that we've recently started the last 3 or 4 years, or whether it's on the on-farm trials that we do across the country with different products. So at the Germinal Research Station in Wiltshire, we have replicated plots and we test the innovation that we think we've got with dedicated science and replicated plots and stats. And then on the on-farm trials, we can put that into practice in a modern farming environment. And so that when we bring you the products, we know that they work in that farming scenario. So with that said, I'd like to introduce you to Helen Matthews. Helen has over 30 years experience in grass and forage management, and I'm very pleased to say that over half of that is with Germinal. So Helen, over to you. The topic for tonight, as you know, is assessing swards and winter grazing plans.
So thank you very much, Ben, and good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. So autumn is really a very good time of year to go and give all your grass and forage swards a really thorough health check. So that's looking at both the overall condition of each field in terms of the species and so on, and the soil health and productivity potential, but also help plan your autumn and winter grazing and forage areas. So autumn grassland management can offer immediate financial gains to the farmer. In that, you know, the longer we can keep animals outside, the more we can save on housing, feeding, labour costs, and so on. That can be worth as much as, you know, £1 to £3 per animal per day. And also, we're going to be reviewing the season's performance at the same time. So field by field and assessing what and how we should improve areas. And therefore, make sure we get everything off to a really good start next spring. So what we sow now and how we manage our grasslands in the autumn can impact on our, you know, on the returns, financial returns, and the future success of the grassland. So what are we going to do? Focusing on the Sward Assessment and what we're looking for. We're going to walk each field in a W as if you were soil sampling or plate metering. You're going to need a spade and a notebook and a pen, or you might be using your mobile phone to keep records. And something to measure grass with. That could be a plate meter, of course, or you know, whatever else you might be using. If you need soil tests, maybe a little bit early at the moment, but provided you've not had any manures or fertiliser in the last sort of 4 to 6 months or so on, then autumn or winter is a good opportunity to do that job. And obviously we want up-to-date soil samples for every field or area that are, you know, taken every 3 or 4 years at the most. So we're monitoring nutrients, the essential nutrients. That's fundamental to what we're doing. We're going to assess the species that are present, whether that represents what was initially sown in that field and the remaining percentages. And think also about the performance of each field. You may be measuring anyway, and therefore you'll have yield data available. You'll probably have a good idea which fields perform the best anyway, and also those that are probably underperforming. So now we want to try and have a look at those and assess why that's the case, and you know what's going on in each area. So record your results, make notes. It's the old adage, if you're not measuring, how can you improve the management? And then score the ley for ground cover and sown species and clover content, and as well as weed content. And if the area is destined for grazing, we'll record the average covers so it can help us start to prepare for autumn. If you're not measuring grass, hopefully you'll have a very good idea of what the stocking rates are, or silage yield information that you can compare with. That might be, you know, counting trailer loads or even big bales. And obviously there's some very clever pieces of kit on the forage harvesters nowadays that can be measuring yields for you. So soil, as we know, is the biggest asset on any farm, and any problem areas that you identify now, it'll be worth having a dig around to see what's happening below the ground. Ideally also, it'll be worth having a dig in what might be a good area to see what your soil profile should actually look like in a good area. Don't forget to use your phone. It can be worth taking some pictures. And always remember when you're doing these sort of sward walks, sward assessments, that you're just looking at the farm on one day. So things do change. Different conditions and weather and so on make it look slightly different. But hopefully we're going to build up a picture. And you've probably already done that all over the season. So the walk's just about confirming your plans and checking our winter forage budget, or your winter forage budget. Worth thinking about why swards deteriorate, really, or mentioning what causes them to deteriorate. It's not always management issues, but there'll be perhaps some things that we can learn that might indicate what we should consider in our management going forward, and we can target those areas for closer attention. And we might, you know, in some instances, consider how we can avoid repeating some of the problems that we've had in the past. So the picture on the left of this slide was taken a couple of years ago now, somewhere up near about 1,200 feet in the Welsh Hills. And the ley there on the left is HSG3. So it's all perennial, intermediate and late heading aber diploids. It's our intensive sheep grazing mixture. But it just goes to show the potential in that particular area, in that particular soil type, you know, when it's well managed, and obviously compared to the field next door. In this instance, we've had a brassica break crop in there of red start, which would have been sown midsummer and then, you know, grazed on in the autumn and over winter, and then the grass reseed would have gone in the following year. So obviously everything does start with the soil. Any imbalance in the soil will make crop management, doesn't matter what crop it is, very difficult, if not impossible. I'm going to look at some examples as we go through the slides later on. And under-grazing and over-grazing, that can cause swards to deteriorate and to break down. Poaching and compaction likewise. When it comes to excessive slurry, well, we don't see that so much as we maybe did quite a few years ago now. People are far more aware of the value of you know, farmyard muck and slurry, and tends to be applied more strategically than it was. But too thick a covering can slurry can smother young tillers, and obviously it carries weeds around the farm as well very often. So that's not so much an issue that we see, but it can cause swards to deteriorate. Drainage, it's always worth checking your drains, making sure, you know, they're not blocked and they're running properly. So you know, swards that sit underwater, you know, will eventually kill grass, because they all need oxygen at some point, and that just encourages weeds to come in the gap. So while drainage isn't cheap, it can be a lot cheaper than buying land. So it's very, very, very much worth the investment. Can be issues sometimes with mixture selection, where maybe non-persistent varieties have been used in longer term leys and they die out there more quickly, or maybe the balance of the ley in terms of heading dates and other species wasn't quite appropriate for the management, and that's caused certain types to dominate, and therefore the you know, the leys started to thin out. And continuous sort of heavy cutting in a ley that's probably needs some grazing as well, that can reduce tiller numbers. You know, so an intensive mowing on a grazing sward, you're likely to find something like 4 times less tillers compared with swards that are being grazed regularly. So just on your soil type again, then there's nothing you can obviously do about your soil type. Your soil type is what you've got. We can't change that. And the other thing that's sort of beyond our control is the weather or the climate. Although nowadays we are formulating with other grass and forage species to help cope with droughts and summer productivity when things do dry out. So herbs and legumes and so on, that can help improve seasonal growth. And also we're breeding for improved tolerance to climate effect, whatever that might be. And that's in all species again of both grasses, legumes and herbs. So what's a starting point? Well, improved grasses and productive swards, they're key to any profitable system. But first of all, we've got to look at the soils underneath them. So that's always the starting point. And poor soil health is often, can be a hidden cost on livestock grassland farms. The soil, there's the physical elements to soil we're looking at, which is the structure, the shape and size of the aggregates and the way they stick together, as well as the soil texture, which is largely obviously an indicator of your soil type. Chemically, so that's the soil analysis and interpretation of the soil test results. So in the first instance, that's going to be pH, P's and K's and magnesium. And if there's a suspicion that there's something a little bit more detailed required, then obviously we can look at broad spectrum analysis, and that will give you a cation exchange capacity figure as well as some of the sort of the minor elements. So we can look deeper into the chemical elements if we need to. And obviously soil biology, so that's looking at the flora and fauna within the soil, earthworms, organic matter and so on, and fungi and bacteria. And we can test for those if we need to. So on our walk, if we need to, we're going to dig a hole. There is a correct way to dig a hole, and basically that's to dig around the three edges. So probably around 50 by 50 sort of centimeters across each of the three edges there, and then just flip it over. So you've got the three edges where the blade of the spade has gone in, and then you'll have an undisturbed side at the back of the hole, and that's where we're going to focus our attention to check for any horizontal layers, any pans within that profile there. Take a good look also at the block of soil that you've lifted, and see just how it sticks together. And we're looking for a nice sort of progressive larger blocks, deeper and sort of a finer tilt toward the surface. And the cracking of those sort of blocks and aggregates, we're looking for vertical cracking all the time. A nice friable area soil towards the surface, obviously. And in the undisturbed end, you can check for those horizontal layers. There may be a different colour, or they will look a different type of structure. They will be compacted. And if you take your pen knife and try and prod in there, you'll soon find that if there is one, they're forming a limiting layer. That's what we call a soil pan. So pay attention. If you find those pans, just work out how deep they are. And we may look in a minute and work out what might have caused those pans, whether it's poaching or vehicle damage or ploughing. So you're looking for, through that soil profile as well, we're looking for sort of vertical root development, really. Probably in grassland, good percentage of grass roots will be going down to around 4 inches, but there will be tendrils that go a great deal deeper than that as well. And obviously if there are other species in there, they will be particularly deeper rooting. You'll see them much deeper than that. Depending really on soil temperature and soil moisture and various things like that, you'd expect to see a good few earthworms in that sort of 50 by 50 block. I think the target number somebody once told me was 16, but I think just the very, very presence of them is a good indicator. And that soil will have a good healthy smell to it, not a sort of a rotten egg or sort of slurry type of smell. Excuse me. So soil structure, it's a few examples here you can see on the bigger picture on the left. There's a few, well, there's plenty of worms actually in there. And then the two smaller pictures on the middle and the right hand side, you can see a classic sort of zigzag of a root there as it tries to force its way, that clover root tries to force its way through a soil pan. And you can see where on the right hand side in the picture there, there's obviously a pan there, and the water hasn't been able to penetrate, so you've got that rusting and oxidation in that layer. So just a few tips of things to look out for. Excuse me. A few more there as well. Again, you can see the one on the left, there's another horizontal layer there that's gone all grey and mottled, and the picture on the right, you can see how the surface layer is actually not particularly well attached to sort of the subsoil. It's very loose, and there's obviously a pan there that's perhaps being caused by poaching. Right, compaction and poaching. Well, usually the thing that grows back when you've had a badly poached area is going to be weeds. Some poaching, you know, you can remedy quite easily, whether that's aerating, just broadcasting a little bit of seed into the surface. But often you're damaging that surface layer, and it's going to restrict the new growth. So grass doesn't always have enough time to recover. So we think about why it's poaching. I know this isn't always easy because we get sort of weather events that have a big influence on this, but stocking rate, you know, if possible, we want to try and avoid high stocking rates when it gets really wet. And you're seeing those pictures there sort of towards the exterior of the field where we've had more traffic. There's probably a pan underneath, and that also has led it to it getting more poached. It's probably near a gateway as well. So, you know, we can try more gateways, more tracks and that sort of things, and moving drinkers and feeders and that sort of thing to avoid excessive damage if at all possible. Machinery also can obviously cause pans, and I know there've been trials in the last few years at both Harper and SRUC where they've recorded you know, quite significant losses caused by both machinery and compaction. Poaching, compaction is what I mean. So when we've established the depth of that pan, there are various tools on the market now to help remedy those pans, or you know, aerate the soil or whatever for you. So you see the one on the left, that's the surface aerator, ideal for where we've got a pan in the surface, a grazing pan. And then the one on the right is obviously a sward lifter, which is going to go a lot deeper, which might be machinery or a plough pan. So the key with this is to target the correct piece of kit for where the soil pan is. And what I'd suggest is that rather than just going ahead and doing lots of acres, it's a good idea to go and trial the machine to make sure it's not causing more damage and that it actually is remedying, you know, the issue that you've identified, before you go on and do lots of sort of large acreages. Now is actually a good time to do this kind of remedial work, so it's dry enough to make a good effect. So we're going to have the shattering and cracking effect that we want, and you're going to open those swards, open those swards so the water can drain through, and any damage that we might do, if there's a little bit of damage to the sward, it's got time to recover before the important time of next spring. So the key is that it's going to be dry enough so we're not smearing the edges or causing more damage than we've already got. Soil sampling. Well, testing every 4 years, sort of a sample every field, or around maybe 4 hectares, 10 acres, down to that sort of 7.5 centimetres, 4 inches in a W across the field. And as we've already said, make sure that we're sampling sort of long after any nutrients, whether that's muck or fertiliser, have been applied. So the cost of a soil sample, it can identify issues with, as we've already said, pH, P and K, and even if you're renting ground, it's worth making sure that you've got an up-to-date soil test for the area that you know that you're taking on. So many processes of fertilising fields and cropping will actually reduce the pH and the P and K status. So, you know, if you're silaging, every ton of dry matter that you take from that land is going to remove around 8 kgs of P and 27 kgs of potash. So they need to be replaced if we're trying to maintain or build our soil indices. And while pH is well known, it's you know, a measure of the acidity, it's the measure of the hydrogen ions present in the free soil moisture, giving us the acidity and alkalinity, therefore, of the soil. But it's worth knowing that hydrogen ions are released when ammonium is converted to nitrate during that nitrification process. So, you know, top dressing with nitrogen fertilizers, that itself is going to reduce soil pH. Target pH depending on soil type. So peatous soils will obviously be slightly lower, and the clay and the calcareous soils are going to be higher. And we always sort of used to talk about grassland pH requirements being between sort of 5.8 and 6.5, and that really is still correct. You know, grass won't fail at those sort of pHs at all, and certainly it will establish comfortably. But we do now, as we sort of people are pushing leys a bit harder, we tend to sort of talk along the lines more of 6+ for optimum production. And when you're in that band moving up to 6.5, that's when you've got sort of optimum phosphate availability. Phosphate's obviously the starter fertilizer when it comes to spring growth and establishment and early root development. Now, soil type, was already said, is going to make a difference to your pH reading, and many indigenous grasses will cope with that much lower pH. So optimum zone though is really where we're going to get that maximum P availability, and that's above 6. Just an example of soil fertility here. So this was some work that was done at one of the upland farms from Ibers at Bronidmauer, and very, very old grassland experiment where large area was reseeded, something like, I can't remember, it's decades ago, 30, 40 years ago. And then they were divided into subplots, sub-paddocks, and they were all treated differently in terms of nutrient application. So some were limed, some had phosphate and potash and nitrogen, some had nothing at all. And then they were monitored over a long period of years. And you can see the two examples that we've got there. The area on the left was limed and regularly received phosphate, potash and nitrogen. The area on the left was just limed. So you can see easily on the left how we've still got, just about see on the picture that it looks as if it's probably a high percentage of perennial ryegrass, but certainly they're competitive and it's out competing the weeds and still supporting a reasonable stocking rate. Whereas on the right hand side, so it's probably slower spring growth, less aggressive perennial ryegrass dominance there, and so with a lot more weed species that have started to take over in that sward.
Helen, can I interrupt you there? We've got a question. Hey, you all right?
Yeah.
How would you go about bringing this field back into production, this field on the right-hand side? How would you go about treating that to bring it back to production?
Okay, yeah, so bear in mind where we are in the uplands in Wales here. So we'd sort of talk to the farmer and make sure we understood the overall plan on the farm and what was going on. But if that was sort of given to me as a field to improve, first thing you would do, obviously with the weeds at that height, you've just got to mow them. There's no herbicide that's going to really hit them very at that height, so I would mow them. There's an old story about July's creeping thistles sure to die, so I'd try and mow them in the summer, and then spray any regrowth if it was appropriate with a good strong broadleaf weed colour. And then looking at that, when we say it's only been limed, the P and K indices are probably quite low. It might be, you know, a field that you target for higher applications of P and K. So the first thing to do would be to try and remove the weed by mowing and then spraying. And if we feel there is a good percentage of perennial ryegrass in there that we can encourage, we'd use P and K and try and bring our indices up and the nutrient availability and try and bring it back to productivity that way. It could be a situation like we saw earlier on that picture with the HSG3, where you know, they just decided to spray the whole field off and start again. So there's various ways, but I think the first one would be get rid of the broadleaf weed with mowing and spraying, and then let's look at the nutrient applications. If your P's and K's are wrong, you've got to deal with them anyway, you know. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Good question. So we mentioned earlier over-grazing and under-grazing, and these two pictures that we've got, or the picture and the graph on the side, show really what's happening when we're over-grazing or under-grazing. So the photograph on the left is 1 week's regrowth, but these were grass plants put in 2 flower pots, as you can see. One was mown once they've established, one was cut every week down to 3 centimetres, and the other one was cut every 3 weeks, so 21 days, but only down to 5 centimetres. And you can see the difference. That's 1 week's regrowth on both of those pots. So by cutting it repeatedly too low, you're cutting into the sort of the heart of the plant, and it's lost all its energy. It no longer has the ability to put up that broad leaf to photosynthesize and keep producing you know, good fresh grass for us to graze. And the reason that happens, if you look at the life cycle of the grass plant on the right hand side, you can see on the first sort of tiny little tiller, the first tiller on the left, we're grazing down there to 4 centimetres. Once we've defoliated the plant, all the energy then is going into producing new leaf. So the plant thinks, I need leaf, I need to photosynthesize or I'm going to die. So all the reserves go upwards to produce new leaf. And then once we get sort of 1 new leaf, 2 leaf, and then 3 leaves, you can see that the energy then can be going back down into the root to you know, build up sugars and help build up the energy in the root. The other thing that picture shows us is that once we've got 3 live leaves, you remember we only get 3 live leaves on a tiller, that first leaf, as soon as we get the 4th one coming out, the first leaf is dying, and that's going to sort of drop off and create all that dead matter in the bottom. So that's why, you know, rotational grazing works, and that's why just grazing that down to 4 to 5 centimetres is the Cree residual that we're always trying to hit, and not graze any lower than that. That's just a sort of a bit of an example of why overgrazing and undergrazing can affect sward performance. Looking now at the actual composition of the sward, by that we mean the preferred species. They will be the sown species. I'm going to mention some of the indigenous species as well now. There might also be, you know, some of the indigenous species are useful in swards. You know, that might sort of be some of the meadow grasses and some of the fescues and so on. But there are also some of the really indigenous species of grasses which are rather unpalatable. They're low yielding and they're very poor at nitrogen use efficiency. I'll show you more of that in a moment. And there are things that we really need to know about them. So we're looking really for a minimum, particularly in grazing leys, I say 60%, probably more than that in our long-term grazing leys, and silage leys, it should really be a lot higher than that. And we don't want any of those, or as few as possible of those undesirable, you know, broadleaf weeds, whether that's sort of docks or buttercup or whatever. They're all going to bring the overall sward quality and yield down, and be poor use of you know, nutrients. So this is some work that was done at the Welsh Plant Breeding Station, and they were testing some of these indigenous species, if you like, comparing them with perennial ryegrass. So they measured the response to 100 kgs of nitrogen applied and compared that to perennial ryegrass. So Yorkshire fog, while sometimes you look at it and think, you know, well, it does yield, it's very unpalatable. But in terms of nitrogen use efficiency, it's only 42% compared to that of perennial ryegrass. And rough stalk meadowgrass at 17% there. So that's the most common weed, meadowgrasses generally, but rough stalk meadowgrass, that's one of the most common weeds that we, grass weeds or indigenous species, if you like, let's not be rude to it. That's you know, very poor utilizer of nitrogen. It's the most common grassland weed species that we would see, and obviously bents as well. So slightly better in end use, but still not very productive. And then if we look at some of the work that John Frame did 30 odd years ago now, he looked at these indigenous species and compared them with modern perennial ryegrass of that era in 1991. So in those days, the perennial ryegrass, the average D value of perennial ryegrass was 73 in those days, and you can see the D value of all the other species there. So Timothy 68, Yorkshire fogs, quite a good D value, rough stalk meadowgrass, and so on until we get down to the bents and creeping red fescue. So D value really really drives livestock production. You can see on the left there, that's the average of the ABBA varieties that are on the recommended list at the moment, 77. In fact, some of the newer ones, the ABBA Ban and ABBA Lee and so on, they're higher than that. They've got a reading of 78. And D value rules, it'll say that on my epitaph. So 1% D value is worth 40 grams a day daily live weight gain in lambs, and no, that's the wrong way down. 40 grams daily live weight gain on beef animals and 20 grams a day on lambs, and it's worth as much of a third of a litre in milk production with dairy cows. So, you know, it's crucial. D value is very, very important of those species. That's what obviously produces the megajoules of energy, which is, you know, another measure of how we measure intake in livestock. Now, that work we were just showing you the results of there from John Frame. This picture we've taken from the Germinal Research Station down in Wiltshire, and we're replicating, as Ben was saying to you earlier on, we're replicating some of that old trial work that was done with John Frame. So looking at some of those indigenous species, meadowgrasses, Yorkshire fog and bents and so on, and comparing them to modern grasses, modern varieties, and looking at them against some of the sort of the modern types of fescues and things like that that we'll be using. So we will eventually have some results from all of this work to be able to share with you. Practical considerations now. Ground cover, target ground cover of at least 75%. That does depend on what is, you know, what the lay's for and what it consists of, whether it's you know, Italians and hybrids for mowing, or whether it's you know, a longer term grazing lay. So depending on what we're looking for, I'll show you some pictures in a moment. Clover content as well, sort of this time of year, you'd be looking for around 30% clover would be the average ideal content. I'll give you some pictures on that in a minute. And then broadleaf weeds, the target really is a lot less than 10%. Now, if you walk sort of 6 meters in one direction and then 7 meters at right angles to that, you sort of started to measure out just over 40 square meters. That's 1% of an acre. And if you're finding more than, you know, well, one probably weed in that area, you're very soon, you know, if there are 5 docks in there, that's 5% docks. So a dock covers quite a large area, don't forget. So do some assessments of what the content is, and you know, the percentage within your sward, and make sure that you're keeping them as low as possible. Here's an example of ground cover here. So that looks sort of fairly open. We can only really see sort of perhaps, I don't know, 20 or 30 yards in front of us. I'm not sure what else, you know, the middle of field would be like, but that lay looks sort of really fairly open. So, you know, give all these areas a good condition, a good score, and support your scoring system with photographs, and you can remember what you've done. So you're calibrating your eye all the time. And it's most important to understand, you know, the difference between the really thick ground cover and an open sward. So a low ground cover score like this, it may be easy to overseed. So, you know, your remedy could be overseeding, and that might be with, you know, even something as open as that looks from where we're standing. You might get away with, you know, a good lay of sort of, you know, it may even be HSG3 or HSG4, something with a lot of diploids in. You know, it wouldn't necessarily have to be a sort of short-term high tetraploid mixture to get that sort of back into shape. You could probably bring that back into life with a you know, a normal sort of longer-term lay. Important really, you know, good ground cover is going to be 95% plus, and it depends on the day that you're looking at the sward, as we've already said earlier, whether it's been recently mown or grazed. But really get to the bottom, really get down into the bottom of that, the butt of that lay, and see what new tillers are emerging and what's really going on in the bottom of the lay. There's a lot of bare ground underneath hidden by the crop, or if the bottom of the lay is so thick that it's sort of stifling new tillers and you've got a lot of dead grass there in the bottom. So, you know, when the bottom becomes rank, it's poor quality grass, grazing quality and live weight gain and so on will be reduced. But also, you know, they won't readily graze into that. Clover content. So the top picture on the left, you might sort of glance at that and think, oh, well, that's easily sort of 20–25% clover. If you were actually to cut that and do the separation, the general rule of thumb is clover is half what you think it is when you look at it. So you've got that flat leaf that looks at you, and say that one on the top, there's probably only around 10–15% white clover actually in there. And the bottom picture that you think, goodness me, that's probably easily 50–60%. Again, if you were to do the same exercise of cutting it and doing the separation, then you'd find that it's around half of what there appears to be visually. So that's a good rule of thumb when you're assessing clover. It's going to be less than it first appears it is.
Helen, yeah. Can I just interrupt you with another question? Susan's asked, are clover varieties becoming more competitive? The last 3 years of new grasslands have been swamped by clover. Okay.
Not necessarily. We do compatibility trials with clover and grass. In fact, at IBAs, when we're breeding, we do trial them under grass, you know, intensive grazing with sheep to see what happens to the clover. So they're not necessarily more competitive. I think they tolerate nitrogen, which probably just makes them lazy. But you know, if you've got if you're mowing and you've got a sort of a smaller leaf clover, you're going to encourage clover dominance. So it's a lot to do with the conditions in the soil, how well it suits clover, but also it can be an indication of management. So we tend to say, you know, if we want to encourage clover, then mowing will encourage clover, because if you think, you know, we mow it and we sort of cut into the plant and we let the sunlight directly down to the bottom of the sward and the stolons can take off. And likewise, if we're grazing, very often those stolons at the end, they can get ripped out, certainly by sheep, or cattle can pull it and help sort of stop clover getting dominant. So it can be you know, management that you need to look at, but also make sure that we've got a balance of the right type of clover for the management. So if it's sheep grazing, you'd be looking at a smaller leaf blend. If it's maybe cattle grazing, you're looking at medium and larger leaf blend of white clovers. And if it's mowing, it's the larger leaf clover. So just have a look at the types of leaf size of clover that you're using if you're having a problem. And some soils, you know, are capable of just growing clover a lot better than others. That's true. Some are harder to get them established just because of the sort of, you know, the soil bacteria and the conditions that favour clover. And obviously, you know, when we get hot, dry years like this one, the only thing that grew in, you know, it was growing at the end of May or in June was the clover. So sometimes that's one of those effects with climate that are a little bit beyond our control. It just sort of comes back down to management. But I don't think, and Ben, you know, you talk to the breeders, the clover breeder probably more than I do. I don't think they're necessarily more competitive than they have been. I think they are better varieties. They're probably higher yielding, maybe a little bit more robust, but I'm not sure that makes them more competitive as such.
No, you're right. There is a drive to produce higher yield and higher protein contents, with a growing point that varies depending on what the management of the clover is going to be, but there is no drive to make them more competitive, no. Thank you.
Good question again. Completed our soil walk, you know, go and record your results, write down everything you've seen, your observations, and try and score them, you know, come up with your own scoring system or highlight problem areas that can be improved, and we can start to plan improvements to alleviate some of the issues. That might just be liming or more strategic sort of P&K applications. And then it might be aerating or thinking about where we need to aerate, sorry. And then obviously look at those paddocks that we're going to keep for winter grazing to get the most out of them before we reseed, or maybe another crop drilling for next season or whatever. And in some areas, there's still time to drill grass or a cover or a break crop. And some of you, of course, will be taking maize off soon. So, you know, there's good soil warmth at the moment, and we'll be thinking about, you know, getting a cover of something in to preserve that soil over winter. So it's certainly still time at the moment to think about, you know, getting grass into bare soils. So just moving on now to grazing management and some tips just to help planning for autumn and winter grazing, making sure we can make the most out of what we've got, but also this is a time of year when we're setting up things so that we can present grazing lay in as good a condition as possible for next spring. So next year's grazing management is really starting now. So we don't have time tonight, obviously, to go through all the different grazing management systems to do any of them a great deal of justice. And really sort of traditionally grazing, I guess, is based on just set stocking and stocking rates and putting a few more in or a few less in to make sure we utilise the grass as best we can. And to a certain extent, it is still very much the case in some places. But now, you know, a lot of us are far more scientific, and they're planning, you know, it's well planned what they're doing, and we have much more sort of strategy about making sure that we're taking detailed measurements to help us plan our approach to grazing. So grazing management's based on the grass growth, obviously, and the animals' required dry matter intake, which is obviously a calculation of their weight and whatever dry matter intake we need according to what they are, what type of stock they are. So we can easily work out what the daily kgs per acre is from growth, and we know what our starting point is, and we can predict what we will have available in terms of grazed grass after a certain period of time. And autumn grazing management, therefore, is going to centre around assessing the animals, the body condition score, and prioritising the highest quality grass for maybe wean stock or flushing ewes or lambs, finishing lambs. And don't forget also at this time of year, if you're growing brassicas for outwintering, you know, crops like red starter swift, Maris kestrel maybe, they're going to keep growing as soil temperatures drop lower, maybe even down as low as 10. So they could keep growing up until November. So it's maybe a little bit early to actually measure them yet, but they're going to make a useful addition to your, you know, your winter forage budget, maintaining a high quality feed. So the benefit with the brassicas in the winter is they do keep their feed quality into well after Christmas. So, but now if you haven't got bales out for feeding fibre in your brassica crops, now's a good time to go and do that before it gets too wet. And you may have identified areas already for deferred grazing, where you may be wanting to buffer feed over the winter if that suits your conditions, or they could just be sacrifice areas or paddocks that you plan on you know, reseeding or a new crop going in next spring. So it's worth going and have a check on those covers as well. And some areas winter conserved forages are well on target, so silage and bales are well on target, but not everywhere by any means. But it's still worth just, you know, checking what you've got and the quality of what you've got. And if you are in an NVZ, well, it's the last applications of slurry on other soils, so not your shallow or sandy soils, but if you're on any other soils, you've got until the 15th of October to apply any high-end fertilizers, so that high-end muck, so that's slurry or poultry manure. That's on other soils, as I say, not the shallow or sandy soils, because that's obviously, that has already closed. Autumn grazing, as well as the actual health check, we're going to have a good look at what our sward heights are then. And if you haven't already, that is, maybe it could be a sward stick or a plate meter or a simple visual tool. It could be a ruler or even marks on the side of your welly. But let's go out and record them paddock by paddock, so we know what our average farm covers are. We're aiming now in our grazing rotation for this residual of 4 to 5 centimetres. So we're trying to clean the layout to the bottom and make sure we're getting light down to those, to the base of the tiller, to the butt of the tillers, to produce new tillers over winter. So pre-grazing height might be starting to increase slightly. Excuse me, we're starting to extend the grazing rotation probably to around 35 days now. So we're building our average grass cover slightly. So, you know, as we finish fields off now, we're sort of going into our last rotation now. Those fields, we're setting them up for, you know, to have grown grass for next spring and turnout. So target heights, really grazing target heights for cattle. Sheep are going to be 2 or 3 centimetres lower than this, but you can see they're pre-grazing for cattle between 12 and 1400, 12 and 14 centimetres, sorry, that's around 3,000 kgs of dry matter. We don't want to let it get too much above that, because, you know, they can waste it. And sheep, as I say, they'll be sort of 2, maybe 3 centimetres lower than that. Might be a little bit higher for finishing lambs, but just a bit lower. So always aiming, though, it doesn't matter what we're grazing it with, we're always grazing for that 4 to 5 centimetres residual to make sure we're going to be producing that high quality growth next year. If you're strip grazing, try and back fence as well to stop them grazing the regrowth. Let's say your rotation will be spreading out now to 35 days, and you know, try not to let them tread too much in. But there are, you know, let's admit there are certain sort of grazing systems where we actually want to grow a bit more. We don't mind them actually treading some into the soil. So, you know, if that's your grazing system, well, you know, that's fine. You're returning nutrients and organic matter back into the soil, as long as that's not going to be interfering with you know, starting next year's spring grazing round by inhibiting growth. Sorry. So closing off your earliest paddocks, so those that you intend to graze first next year, they're the ones that we're going to close first next year. And I would imagine some of those paddocks are going to be grazed out, you know, within the next week or 10 days, and start closing up for next year. So generally they're going to be grazed in the same order next spring that we shut them off this year. Now, so, but do go and have a look. If you look at the Grass Check GB website, there's some very useful information there. So all the contributing farmers are sending information on a weekly basis of both grass growth, so around 55 kgs of dry matter on the dairy farms, a little bit lower on the beef and sheep farms, but still excellent quality in those swards, sort of between 19 and 21% dry matter on those swards, with 17 to 18% protein, 18% sugars, and very good ME of 11.2 to 11.6. So you know, they're sort of very good figures still for grass. And these results are taken from fresh grass samples that are sent in on a weekly basis by all the participating farmers. So some very useful information on that website and with the HDB to, of course, to just check what's going on. Just a quick run through a very basic, simple forage grazing budget. So we just need the size of the areas to be grazed and our starting covers, and predicted grass growth for the months ahead. So we've got, as you see, the top line there, we've got an average farm cover across that 50 hectares. We've got 2,400 kgs of dry matter, and we've got 50 hectares. So in November, there'd be 30 days in November, April, June and November. So there's 31, grazing days in November. And typically, grass growth in November would be around 15 kgs of dry matter a day. We've got 150 steers in there. Average weight is around 300 kgs. We're trying to get some live weight gain on them, so we're trying to get an intake of around 2.5% of their body weight. So they need to eat around 7.5 kgs of dry matter a day. So the daily requirement is that 1,125 kgs of dry matter. Got 50 hectares across the and across the area we've got 150 animals, so we've got a stocking rate of 3, which gives us that allocation per day, that daily requirement of 22.5 kgs of dry matter. So if our grass is growing at 15 kgs of dry matter, we're actually in a deficit. We're grazing 22.5, but it's only growing at 15. So we've got a deficit in our allocation of minus 7.5. But because we've got starting covers of 2,400, we keep grazing off that after that 31 days, we'll still have a final pasture cover at the end of the month of 2,100, nearly 2,200. So still good enough covers to support growth. And put the figures in, the same figures again for December. The animals hopefully will have put on 0.5 kilo at least. They're going to be eating a little bit more, so that the daily allocation will be greater. And then obviously, you know, we're going to be utilising a bit more because they're a bit bigger and they're grazing a bit more. But we've still got covers at the end. So we take that figure off the 2,167 there, and we get the residual farm pasture cover there, sorry, of 1,742. So that lays just about coming to its end, but it, you know, it's a very simple way of producing a budget to show you, you know, get your starting covers, work out what your stock numbers are going to be, what their weights are, and how much you think they're going to eat, and then you can see how long those paddocks or those areas, that grazing area, is going to last you. So just a quick mention about managing any new lays, any late summer reseed. So just have a good look for any weeds. Don't forget, you know, if there were a lot of docks around before, there could be quite a high, you know, seeds that are dormant in the soil. They can live for a very long time in the soil, and they're so much easier to spray out at the seedling stage. So if it's necessary, so do have a good look for any weeds and make sure you deal with them. When it comes to grazing, so probably sort of stating the obvious really, but make sure the surface is firm enough to carry stock. So, you know, if you do make a mess of it, it gets too wet, the surface will be too tender and you just won't get it back. So try not to graze it if it is wet. And grazing, really, you should view this as part of your reseeding management. If we can practice on-off grazing in the winter, that's going to be ideal. Again, don't let them graze it too tightly, no less than that sort of 4 or 5 centimetres again. And before you let them graze, go and have a go at what we call that pull test, which is mimicking animals grazing. So get in, grab the lay, grab a handful of grass and give it a good yank and tear it off with your hands. And we want, you know, the plant just to rip as if the animal's actually biting it. And we want nothing to be, you know, to pull out. We don't want any leaf. And that will, by you know, just defoliating that, keep managing that grazing, you're going to promote tillering again and maximise ground cover in the future. It's going to help reduce the weed ingress, and also it's getting light again down to the butt of that grass, and it's going to encourage new tillering. And by the same score, don't let those leys get too heavy, those new leys get too heavy either, if you can help it, because that will just create shade, and you know, you'll finish it with dead grass in the bottom again, which will inhibit the new growth from the bottom of the grass of the plant. So just quickly then, really in summary, I'd say identify areas of grassland for either your deferred winter grazing. They may be areas where the you know, your buffer feeding, but go and check the winter forage budget. It's worth putting the numbers down and recording what you've got. Have a really thorough assessment of all your forage areas, and yeah, as I said, you know, just remember that you are only looking at the farm on a day, on one particular day, but review what happened last year. How did your fertilizer policy go? Did it, you know, was it as good as you think? Did you get the response from fertilizer that you thought you were going to do? That can be an indicator in itself that there's something that you need to look at, and make some decisions for you know, what you're going to plan to start doing next spring. What I would say is it is only a plan. You know, it's not cast in concrete, and you know, we're not looking for a 5-year plan. We're looking for pointers. And it might be, you know, some of the easiest things to do are going to be the quicker gains. You know, it could be overseeding or dealing with P&K and aeration. So it doesn't have to mean that, you know, we're going in there hard. We want to pick kind of the low hanging fruit, the areas where it's going to make the quickest and the most least risk and the most financially secure decisions in terms of, you know, improving those leys without the risk that we're going to lose anything. So it's worth having a really thorough assessment of what we've got there, and making those plans so we know where we're going to start next year. Thank you very much.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Helen. Right, well, I'm very pleased to say there's nearly 70 people online. So as you can imagine, we've got lots of questions, and I'm afraid there's no way we'll get through them all now. But Helen, one for you. What importance do you place on micronutrients for maintaining of productive sward and livestock health?
Micronutrients, well, in terms of soil health, I tend to focus generally on, you know, pH and P&K. Micronutrients, while they can be, you know, important more maybe for the plant, so you're thinking of things like maybe boron, you know, they're not necessarily particularly for animal health. So it's just a question of making sure that there's a balance between them. But certainly, yeah, if there is an imbalance, then you need to think about how you're going to deal with it without being specific about any particular one. It's something to look at. I wouldn't look at them at the outset unless I thought there was a problem, but certainly the broad spectrum analysis are going to give us a more detailed information. And yeah, they are, yeah, definitely, you know, they're worth looking at.
Okay, one here that I might answer. This is from Adrian. Nice to hear from you, Adrian. Is there any breeding or trialing going on around perennial ryegrass being grown at lower temperatures than the 5 degrees in mid-Wales? Very specific question, but Adrian's referring there to the 358 rule, the Italian growing at 3 degrees C, the perennial at 5, and the clovers at 8 degrees C. There is work goes on with it. If you think of the hybrids, which are the cross between the perennial and the Italian, then they are growing at lower temperatures. The downside to that, of course, is that they're not going to last you as long in a long-term lay. My advice for that scenario, if you're talking about the shoulders of the season, is look at the recommended list. You've got aspects on there that tell you the seasonal growth of the different varieties. So, for example, Abergain, which is a late tetraploid, has actually the highest figure for spring growth of any variety on the recommended list. Abermagic, intermediate diploid, very good ground cover, again, very good back end growth in the autumn. So from that point of view, I would look at picking the varieties to suit the type of management that you're going to subject it to. Question from Graham. Helen, would you advocate grassland farmers to aim for a pH of 6.5 to improve nutrient availability rather than the old 5.8 to 6?
I'd certainly encourage people to be higher than 5.8, but it depends very, very much on your soil type. So if you've got a peaty soil, for start off, you probably never get it to 6.5. But if you've got a good, you know, medium clay loam, then I'd encourage people to certainly get above that 6.3, yeah. Yeah. But it is very dependent on soil type.
Okay. Possibly the last question. Howard's asked, with drought seemingly becoming more common, are breeders looking to breed cocksfoot varieties with better D values, or is there scope for crossing a drought tolerance traits of cocksfoot into perennial ryegrass?
I'm not sure how you cross a cocksfoot with a ryegrass. Maybe it could be done. It's a great pity that 100 years ago we didn't start breeding cocksfoot, and we may have the kind of quality that we see now in ryegrasses. So I'm not sure what cocksfoot breeding we're doing. We did do some because we produced a variety, Abertop, which was quite a palatable variety, but it's they're not very good on the sort of the seed production. In fact, it's impossible to get viable seed from it. So I don't know of any other people. There must be some cocksfoot breeding, Ben.
There is a very small cocksfoot program, but the problem, as you say, is the seed production. What I would talk about there, or what I would mention there, is things like Aberroot, where we have not crossed a cocksfoot with a perennial, but we are crossing an Atlas fescue from Africa. So we are getting the drought resistance from that fescue with the qualities of the perennial, and we have some of that seed available now, and we've got it placed in about 6 different places so far this summer to monitor that performance over the years. As I said at the very beginning, we've also got it placed in replicated trials at Joe's at the Germinal Research Station and other places. So yes, there are things coming down the pipeline that look as if they will help with that drought tolerance. Obviously, as Helen mentioned, the other big species to consider are the clovers and the legumes, and the herbs, the plantains and chicories with their deep rooting structures able to survive the drought. And again, at the research station, we've seen excellent results through the dry periods of the year with those species. David says, when would you say the cutoff is for sowing red and white clover?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because not that many years ago, well, maybe it is, I'm perhaps a bit older than I think I am, we would have given a cut-off for clover of the 3rd week in August. And now I think, and if you think about autumn we're having now, we've got very warm soils, and everything's still jumping out of the ground. So it is really, I would say now, too late for red clover, but it might be worth risking white clover in a complete reseed. Really, depending on where you're farming as well and how warm your soils are, once you get past the end of August, so your risk increases, and what will happen is you will get some plants established, but not 100% as it gets colder. So I would, depending on where I am, I would cut off red clover probably end of 1st week in September. White clover I may try for a little bit longer than that, because it's sort of a different type of plant, and you're going to get the stoloniferous growth on it. But certainly 3rd week in September, it's the end for clovers, really.
Okay, one more. You mentioned early on in your talk about using brassicas to bring ground back into production. Can you just go through how you would do that? Yeah,
so we would do this very successfully, not only in the uplands, but all sorts of grassland areas. And you can either use it as a summer break crop, or for autumn and indeed out wintering. If you are in the uplands, if you're farming in a marginal area, then you've obviously, stating the obvious, got a much shorter growing season. So we do need good pH if we're going to go brassicas. So we might be liming the previous autumn to make sure that we've got a good pH. Then as soon as we've got a good cover of grass in May, we spray it off, get it grazed right down, and then slot seed or direct drill, or just rotivate lightly and just cultivate the surface enough to sow the brassica seed. Maybe red start probably if you're in the uplands, because it's much quicker to establish than a kale. Just sow it in that top centimetre. If you've got a lot of old turf about still, it's worth getting one of these quick acting limes just to neutralise the acidity, and then again, feed the crop, and then you'd be grazing that within, well, perhaps 3 months or a bit longer. So it would fit 3 months or even shorter time than that, sorry, if you're further south, if you're further down the hill, as it were, and graze it either from sort of October, November through until January, February, and then you'd reseed again in the spring. If it's a summer, if you can drill it in May, there's no point drilling them until soil temperatures are around 10. But if you are up there at the beginning of May, you can drill them in May. If you're in the lowlands in good country, good soils, 8-10 weeks later, you'd be grazing them off, and you can get back into grass, you know, the following September. That used to be very much the sort of traditional reseeding in a lot of dairy farms when I was kind of learning the trade, if you like. First cut mid-May, maybe the third week in May, scratch your brassica in, cows would graze it. It was very much a sort of a drought buster type crop, and then come September, end of August, early September, back into you know, a grazing lay, and that'd be shut up. It might get sheep on it in the winter, and we'd be back into, you know, full dairy production with that lay the following year. So we nearly always used a break crop, whether it was a summer drought buster or, you know, autumn and outwintering. But pH is important for brassicas. Good seed bed, clean seed bed, and shallow drilling, and you know, don't be afraid to feed them. You know, you're expecting them to put on a lot of bulk in a short period of time. So the better you look after them and the better the attention to detail at establishment, the more they'll reward you.
Great. Thank you very much, Helen. I'm going to wrap it up there. I'm sorry, we've got still plenty of questions that we will put responses to and send them out with the link to the video to this. Please, can I invite you to go to the Germinal website? We are put a lot of effort into that recently. There's a lot of information in there on management of brassicas, management of grass, lucerne, other products, a lot of product information as well. It's a very good resource now to have a look for this grassland management stuff. And also, please complete the survey at the end of this webinar. There's only a few questions, and it gives us an idea on how we've done. And also, there's a chance there to see what topics, you know, suggest topics that you'd like us to cover as we go through the winter program. We do have a program in place, but we can always add in webinars or change things. And finally, thank you very much for attending. Very good number. Thank you very much. And our next webinar is Tuesday, the 3rd of November, when we're going to look at outwintering brassica and setting up for that brassica grazing through the winter. So for now, thank you very much. Good night and have a pleasant evening. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.